Today, I'm going to be speaking with Amanda Makki, who's an attorney and also a Republican strategist. And I'm hoping to get some insight, Amanda, into how you see the sort of last 4 years of the Republican Party. And maybe we can just work backwards. Why do you think Trump lost in 2020?
I have said all along, and thank you for having me on your show. But I have said all along, I think this election in 2020 was a referendum on the pandemic. It was really a coronavirus election, and how some people viewed the handling of President Trump as not wearing a mask, not enforcing that, not pushing and promoting those policies, versus Joe Biden, who was, in his basement. He was kind of in hiding and seclusion, which maybe a lot of people actually agreed with. That it was, you had to be isolated, you should be. And so I think it was really the dichotomy of how people viewed the pandemic and how they viewed the response to the coronavirus by the two different camps.
I basically agree with you. I mean, I've said before that if you look at countries where world leaders handled the virus well, or at least the perception is that they did, and you talk about New Zealand, you talk about Australia, other places, had Trump just said, hey, you know what? We're printing MAGA masks. If he had said that on March 20th of 2020, and we're letting the doctors handle this, I think he essentially sails to re-election. And I think the proof is, and maybe here we'll start to disagree, his major campaign promises, he didn't do any of them. The U.S.-Mexico border wall, he added 50 miles. He was going to replace Obamacare. He didn't do it. He said he would pay off the debt within 4 years. He increased it, right? And it really didn't matter. And we can talk about why it didn't matter, but I think without question, if he just handles the pandemic moderately well, he wins.
I think that he viewed his handling of the pandemic ultimately as a success, because you do now have three or four, depending on the country, vaccines that are on the market, at least in the United States. At the end of his term, there were two vaccines on the market, which I have always said, having worked in healthcare policy as a healthcare attorney, I mean, that's nothing short of Nobel Peace Prize winning. And you can't say that it's not. Now, you can't just say that was all President Trump, but certainly pushing on all the levers to get that to market. He said that during the campaign season, and people laughed at him. People mocked him and said, there's no way, he's just lying. And in December, we were vaccinating people.
Well, but let's
So
break that down a little bit, though, because there's a bunch of pieces there. So, okay. Yes, Trump certainly funded the manufacture of vaccines, and he did the pre-purchasing of vaccines on spec before we even knew whether these vaccines were going to be approved. That's good. Any president would do that. I mean, to give him too much credit for that seems a little strange. But when you think about the trajectory, there were people saying December, it's never going to happen. In May, Goldman Sachs put out to the month an accurate prediction saying, based on the research that's being done around the world, we expect healthcare workers to start being vaccinated in November. And here's where I really am curious, like what exactly you think Trump did on vaccination, because the Pfizer vaccine was developed by Turkish immigrants to Germany. The Moderna vaccine was sequenced before Donald Trump even knew what was going on with the pandemic. Like, what exactly did Trump do on the vaccines? Maybe we can figure it out.
Well, I think just pushing on every lever of the government to get that done. I mean, Operation Warp Speed. Even Dr. Fauci's boss, Dr. Francis Collins of the NIH, has said that Operation Warp Speed deserves a lot of credit. And so I think when you have a CEO, which obviously he was for many years, as president, there's just, I think he had just a line of sight to make sure that this happens. And you can say that, well, this was all in the works. Well, mRNAs have been studied for a decade. So yes,
Right.
I mean, technically pharmaceuticals are always in the works. But pushing that through to happen in December, no one believed that,
But what did
especially
he
on
do to
the left.
push it?
And they mocked him for that.
Who did he push, though? What did he push?
Well, I can't say exactly what he pushed. I didn't work in the Trump administration. But what I can say is that when he said every day we're working through Operation Warp Speed to get this done, everything that comes together through the government, whether it's lifting regulations or making it easier to get through the chambers of government. I worked in Congress for, a decade, and it's not easy to just get through a very clunky federal government and bureaucratic system.
But Amanda, what regulations
ultimately resulted in vaccines?
You're
when
going to have
everyone
to
said that it wouldn't happen.
you're going to have to give me something specific, because so far you said you don't actually know, but Trump said he was working hard, which often means watching Fox News and tweeting. What regulations were lifted to make this happen more quickly?
Look, again, I'm not going to give specifics because I don't know exactly what he did, and he never said what he did.
Right. So you don't know he did anything.
I'm sorry?
You can't really say he did anything then.
I think that's absolutely false. Now, you can look back and say, well, he said this or he said that, and that wasn't true. But what the ultimate result was of these vaccines coming to market, I don't think you can deny that.
Deny which part? That the vaccines were made?
That the vaccines were made in record time. In record time, they were made. And I am sure that there are regulations that were lifted. There were things within the government that were done by this administration to ensure that happened with record speed. I mean, usually it takes a decade.
Not for mRNA vaccines.
And therapeutics to come to market.
Not for mRNA vaccines. All right, let's move on, Amanda, because I do have other things I want to talk about. But if at some point there's something specific you can tell me Trump did, rather than just he was claiming that he was doing stuff, we will report it.
It's not about claiming. I mean, even when the NIH head, like I said, who is Dr. Fauci's boss, said Operation Warp Speed deserves credit. He didn't say Pfizer deserves credit. He said Operation Warp Speed. Operation Warp Speed was a function of the Trump administration.
Yes. Now, the two vaccines that were first approved weren't part of it. They did pre-purchase vaccines, but fine. Okay, good. So let's talk a little bit about policy. My interpretation of the Republican Party right now, and basically since the pandemic, is that it's essentially a party of no. It's we don't want to do infrastructure. We don't want to do coronavirus guidelines. We don't want to do DACA. We don't want to do tax reform. We don't want to. So there's been really no substantive proposals of policy of what they want. Certainly, we don't want to do any changes to gun legislation. Now, I've said, I don't know that it's a bad strategy for Republicans. And what I mean by that is, when you look at a candidacy like Madison Cawthorn, for example, his aide or his staffer straight up said, we're not running a policy office. We're running a communications office. It's memes and tweets and talking about I can put two guns on my wheelchair and all this sort of stuff. So my question is, do you think that this is a viable long-term strategy? It might actually be. Like, I don't know that the Republican Party really needs policy given who's voting for them right now.
Well, the Republican Party doesn't control a single lever of the government in Washington right now.
But the last 2 years of the Trump administration, they did.
They had the Senate.
And the White House.
They had the White House and they had the Senate.
Yeah.
And the House was controlled by Democrats.
Right.
So if you're talking about right now, because you were talking about topics for right now, because certainly Trump tried to do infrastructure and the Democrats said no. But if you're looking at issues right now, look, Mitt Romney did an interview and, Mitt Romney is the king of rhinos, I guess you could say. I mean, he would probably be the most moderate, the most willing to work with Democrats. And even he has said that going at this alone on the coronavirus bill, relief bill, was wrong. He and I believe it was 9 other Republican senators visited with the president at the beginning of February and said, Mr. President, let's pare this bill down. Mr. President, we have other ideas. And President Biden not only did he not listen, he didn't pay attention to a single one of their interests. And it sounds like staff was involved in this.
Yeah.
So be it. The point is, if you want to look back on President Trump, he passed 5 coronavirus bills with bipartisan support. And President Biden didn't do that with bipartisan support.
But Amanda, that's an indictment of Republicans. That's an indictment. The fact you're absolutely right. When it was Trump saying we have to get money to businesses and the American people, Democrats didn't say, we are going to deny this to Trump merely because he's in the other party, because the American people need it. When Democrats said, okay, well, now it's us, we'll do a relief bill that's very similar to what Trump did, Republicans said, we're not participating at all. So what you've just said is arguably the biggest indictment of the obstructionist Republicans that I can
think you're
imagine.
misinterpreting what I said.
No,
Or
I don't think so.
using your own facts, because what I said is that the Republicans went to visit with President Biden,
Yeah.
and he dismissed everything that they said. He didn't take a single thing into account. He didn't even work with them. He didn't even come to the table and say, let's sit down and talk. They had
What
one
concessions
meeting,
did
and the
Trump
meeting
make
went
to
away.
Democrats?
And he largely blamed it on staff, as did Republicans, the staff saying, we're not interested.
But what concessions did Trump make to Democrats on the COVID bills?
Kennedy Center funding, certainly other pieces of the bill that ultimately the law that Republicans were raked over the coals for. I know
Kennedy Center, wasn't that like $3 million or something?
It doesn't matter. It's the fact that, this is what's interesting to me.
Yeah.
President Trump was impeached by the House. And then 3 months later, he has Nancy Pelosi sit down with Stephen Mnuchin, because they obviously, Trump and her didn't have a relationship.
Right.
And he said, sit down and work something out for the American people. And they did. That's leadership. You don't pout and say, I don't like her, so I'm not going to work with her. I think that's what Biden did. Biden said, I don't have to work with you guys because we have 50-50 and Kamala will be the tie-breaking vote. So I don't have to work with you guys. So I'm not going to.
Right.
And
Trump. But
really
I think isn't the difference, Amanda, that Trump would have done that if he had had the luxury of having the House. He just didn't. That's not anything to, I mean, it was just a reality.
We can't work in hypotheticals, but I look at someone who was impeached in the House by Nancy Pelosi, and 3 months later, she sat down with his Treasury Secretary and hammered out a bill for the American people.
But the reason she had to sit down with Mnuchin was Trump, didn't want to play in the sandbox with her anymore because of the impeachment. It's sort of like a criticism of Trump, really.
He had his proxy work with her. The ultimate result was a COVID relief bill, wasn't it?
Yeah, just like with Biden, right? The ultimate result was a COVID relief bill.
A partisan COVID relief bill.
Is it partisan if 75% of Americans support it? That's tens of millions of Republicans. What's partisan?
COVID relief, of which 90% of this bill does not go to COVID relief.
We've debunked, I've debunked that extensively. I don't want to jump into that. So let's not jump into that. In the few minutes we have left, what is the policy right now that you think Republicans should be focusing on? What policy? Now, I know you're saying, well, they don't control anything right now. Okay, fine. But when Trump controlled everything, you still had Democrats proposing things and saying, this is what we would like to see. What are the main policy points you think would be advantageous to the Republican Party right now to be working on?
Well, the Republican Party can't work on anything right now. It would have been nice if the Democrats proposed an actual infrastructure bill, because, as you know, infrastructure is a key word for bipartisanship.
Right.
But when you have a bill that's introduced that even Democrats can't agree on, where the majority of it is not for actual roads and bridges.
But this isn't my question.
I'm sorry?
I didn't ask anything. I'm just saying, what should be the policy priorities of Republicans?
Well, if Republicans were in control, I think that lowering healthcare costs should be an important demonstration of their efforts to help Americans, especially after the last year. Americans have consumed a lot of healthcare, so making sure that whether it's deductibles, out-of-pocket costs are not prohibitively expensive for Americans, and certainly making sure drug costs come down. I think you can work in a bipartisan way on that. Look, I know immigration is the third rail of politics, but we have got to revisit our immigration policies.
Right.
When our immigration policies are tailored towards the 1990s mentality of, well, you have people coming from Central America and Mexico to the United States to work, adults. You don't have 7-year-olds walking over by themselves. You don't have these coyotes, dropping these kids over the fence. That's the new normal in our immigration. And if Republicans and Democrats don't tackle this, that's going to have a huge impact on the United States and workers in the United States. We still have high unemployment numbers. And if we're allowing mass migration to happen and not doing anything to enforce the borders, we're going to have problems in all 50 states.
So healthcare and immigration would be your priorities if Republicans could get things done right now.
I think they just need to sit down and reevaluate the situation. I mean, what's happening right now is that you have coyotes bringing children across the border.
Yeah.
Why? Because our policies are not to send children back. Title 42, don't send the children back. They're allowed to stay here. That's why parents are willing to separate from a 7-year-old and allow a stranger to take them across the border for a better life in America. We have got to prioritize what are the needs of the United States. I'm sure there are needs that the United States has, and to say, okay, we are going to allow for this worker, that worker that we need, and then set immigration policies that way. But if we're nothing, we're a country of laws, and you have to reevaluate the entire situation. You can't look at laws from 30 years ago or 40 years ago and say, well, this is our immigration policy. Clearly, it's not working.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me when you look at for Americans, I'm not saying immigration is not an issue. It just ranks very low in priorities. The priorities are, the state of the economy, jobs, wages, healthcare. You did mention, and I think that certainly would be there, although we might disagree about the solutions. Immigration is just quite far down the list for most Americans.
Well, I think that may change when you have, in the month of March alone, 171,000 migrants coming to our southern border.
Yeah, it's not really changing. I mean, the polling is pretty steady. It's just not that important to most people. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I just think it's a very inside politics issue for most people. I don't know that it's a winning issue for either party, to be quite frank.
Well, it may not be a winning issue, but we have an immigration crisis. Unfortunately, the president and vice president have not visited the southern border. As bad as it is, they still haven't gone there. And I understand they don't want the media to be there to see what it is.
What would they learn from going, though? What would they learn from going that someone can't tell them?
What would they learn?
From going to the border that someone can't tell them?
It's the perception. You're the president of the United States. You have a southern border crisis and you refuse to go.
Got it.
Kamala Harris has been tasked with this. What has she done in the last 2 weeks since she has been tasked with this to show that this is an important issue? There's a crisis on our border. 7-year-olds are being dropped over fences to be able to come into the United States.
No, that's fine. That's fine. But you're saying it's the going to the border is about optics. They could learn everything from DC.
It's about transparency. There's been a media blackout. And that's not transparency. This was supposed to be the most transparent administration. Yeah. And it hasn't been.
Yeah. Also, I do think that they need to be more transparent with the video from some of the facilities. They've released some, but not others. So that's a beautiful point of agreement, Amanda, on which we can end. Amanda Makki, attorney and Republican strategist, telling us many different things, which I am sure our audience will find very interesting. Amanda, I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.